have pity on Julie. She's already heard this sermon. Though if you can spot the changes, let me know. Oh. I say Sheridan probably gets the one that's more tailored, but you guys get the one that's more refined, because I have an extra week of like, everybody was looking at me glassy-eyed during that section. I need to rewrite it because it made no sense apparently. So, but was anyone else raised in a church that loved to preach on how much we should fear God, but never explained what that actually meant? Or is it just, oh, good. Because I will admit, the concept is all over Scripture, right? Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, Proverbs says, right? Almost every law in Deuteronomy and Leviticus seems like to say something like, don't abuse your neighbor, but fear your God. The prophets crying out against the people's sins mourn that, they do not fear the Lord. But fear has often been used over the years as a primary motivator for people to come to God, right? Because fear is really simple. You don't have to know about something to be afraid of it. In fact, not knowing much about something makes it easier, far easier, to be afraid of it. There's no nuance, there's no relationship needed to fear. It's insidious. Once we're afraid of something or afraid of someone, it is incredibly difficult to fully leave that behind. And it's a great way of controlling someone. Hellfire and brimstone preachings in the early 1900s painted pictures of why you should be afraid of your future. Right? Sinners in the hands of an angry God is still one of the most famous sermons from the last 150 years. And many churches, pastors, and even parents took their cue that if God could rule by fear, then we can too. And use that fear to cement their own power over people. I grew up with sermons where the preacher would scream fear at us, though often with mixed results. When Naomi and I were engaged, we attended her home church for the first time. Little Nazarene church outside Ewan, Washington. Yeah. If you don't know where Ewan is, Google doesn't either. But you go east 5 miles to the larger city of St. John. And then you go east 5 miles to the larger city of Endicott. And then you go east 5 miles to the larger city of Colfax. And then if you keep going east, you eventually reach Pullman. And then you might know where that is. But the pastor decided in the middle of that sermon, never having been introduced to me before, to make the two of us as primary illustrations, claiming that Jesus was coming back in anger, catching a ride on a galaxy that had newly been discovered and which he believed was coming toward us, which, if the red light shift had occurred, would have made far bigger news. And also, why you would want to say Jesus is coming in 2.5 billion years makes no sense to me, but whatever. He was convinced that Jesus was riding on this galaxy that was coming towards us. So we needed to listen to his guidance or we would all perish, especially those who are most susceptible to sin. And at this point, right at the newly engaged couple in the front row, which, to be fair, it probably was right, considering I spent the entire service staring at Naomi. But it was also an obvious attempt to exert power by fear. But at the time, I was just confused by his bad theology and his bad science. But as a modern-day prophet, trademark, he felt entitled to rule by fear because weren't the Old Testament prophets calling on people to fear God all the time when the people weren't listening? Well, yeah, I mean, they were, but it didn't have much to do with what we actually consider fear today. And I try and stay out of the weeds in my preaching, but I'm afraid to explain why we're going to have to get a little weedy, okay? specifically with language. So first, we know languages are not static things, right? Languages change. We know this because it's harder to understand our kids talking to their friends than it is us talking to our friends, right? So we know languages change. It's harder to read Shakespeare than it is to read Mark Twain, and it's harder to read Mark Twain than an author that just wrote last year. Words fall in and out of favor with styles of speaking shift, grammar shifts, but more than that, meanings of specific words also radically change. So let's just, as an example, look at just the word bulldogs, right? Originally, they were bully dogs. But people started to think that that meant that they were mean and they were violent and they'd push you around and they'd really hurt people, right? They're bullies. To the point that bully dogs, and especially pit bullies, are often banned in cities across the country. But many bulldogs at the same time, the traditional name for bully dogs were nanny dogs, because they were so kind and so good with kids that you could leave your kids for the day while you went to work with your bully dog, and they'd keep them in the yard and contain them and make sure that they'd be safe and protect them. Now, how exactly do we get it is both the most dangerous dog that you shouldn't be allowed to be in the city, and it's the safest dog that you leave with your kids at the exact same time from the exact same dog, right? Little weird. Well, if we go back to Shakespeare's era, he can have one of his characters in Henry V praise the king by saying, and it's a mouthful and there's a bunch of weird words, "The king's a Bacchac and a heart of gold, a lad of life, an imp of fame, of parents good, a fist most valiant. I kiss his dirty shoe, and from heart string I love the lovely bully." Now, he isn't slamming the king. Back then, bully meant sweetheart, a darling of a person. Oh, he's a bully. He's lovely. Bully dogs were sweetheart dogs. That's how they got their name. They weren't fighters or killers. They were lovely. They were darlings. But bully, the word, changed from being sweet to being attractive. From attractive to strong, from strong to aggressive, from aggressive to a modern bully. And bully dogs, despite being nanny dogs, despite being the same exact dog they always were shunned, were treated differently, so different sorts of people bought them and trained them. And then we start running into problems. Because different people train them with different expectations, because the same dog had their own words' meaning changed over time. And there's nothing they could do about it, and now they're banned and trained for fighting. These sweetheart dogs that we used to let raise our kids. Which, don't get me wrong, I'd still trust a bulldog over a great many people, but that's a different issue. But the same thing happens with words in the Bible. Not over just a few hundred years, but over the 1,000 years that the Bible was written. Especially with Hebrew, with the Old Testament's languages. And here's where things get weedy. I know, you thought we were there. So Hebrew is a strange language. And you need to pretty much always keep in mind that it was born when the people were slaves in Egypt. Like, they did not speak Hebrew when they went into Egypt. They developed Hebrew as a specific language while they were slaves, and then fully formed it as they were, specifically as a written language, after they left. Okay? So it was meant to be a simple, fast language. They didn't need to communicate great concepts. They needed to know basic stuff to keep them going, keep them alive, and fast so you could shout it back and forth. So every root word in Hebrew only has, or more accurately had, 3 letters. No vowels, they didn't have vowels. So 3 letters. That kind of limits how many words you can have in your language, quite drastically, right? So every word needed to have a much larger range of meaning than English or Greek, the language of the New Testament. So in English, we like to make every meaning as small as we can, every word as precise as we can, right? We might say that we're going to go see a gastroenterologist or a cardiologist or a neurologist, right? They would simply say healer. Big picture word. And then you can add others. It's a gut healer. It's a head healer. But it's just a healer. Because they don't have enough letters to make it more specific than that. So you add in other words. That's also sometimes why reading the Old Testament, it seems like they take this long to say this thing, because they didn't have a word for it. So they just kept stringing stuff together until it had the meaning they were after. So they needed a word because they were slaves to say how you relate to someone in power over you in order to stay safe and healthy. What do you need to do to keep the boss from killing you and to keep him happy? And this was an incredibly important word to a bunch of slaves. So the word is yare, but we normally translate it as fear. But for today, I want to translate it as sure, boss. Okay? It's everything that you need to give someone more powerful than you, because if you don't, then it might be a problem. Yeah, boss. That person. And this is a language born in slavery. Remember, the official word that you are supposed to use to refer to God is master. We translate it as Lord because master creeps us, the ever-living daylights, out. But it is. It's master. So it really shouldn't be any surprise that fear is a part of this word, is a part of yare, part of how you successfully, sure boss. But it meant so much more. Because it could mean to cower, to serve, submit, respect, admire, revere, fear, follow, even to love. As time went on, fear began to have the main connotation. After all, life is often scary, and people often wanted to use the fear, not just the sure boss, of God against others. Leviticus 19:3 says, each of you must sure boss his mother and father. Well, that's the same word, but that's definitely not fear, right? Like every one of you must be terrified of your parents. If that applies to your parents and your relationship, I am so sorry. It's got to mean more than that. Habakkuk 3:2 says, Lord, I have heard of your name. I stand in sure boss of your deeds, O Lord. Renew them in your day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. Well, that's not fear either. You don't hear of how awesome someone is and then are terrified of them. You know, this is the best person. He is just so awesome. You should wet yourself when you come in contact with them. They're like, no, that's not how we do things. But you might hear about how awesome somebody is and make them your boss because you heard how great of a person they are to work for. You might, yeah, boss. There's a lot of examples like this. Proverbs 8:13 says, to yeah, boss the Lord is to hate evil. I hate pride and arrogance, evil behavior, and perverse speech. Now, translating that as fear doesn't make any sense in the world, and yet most translations do. To fear the Lord is to hate evil. Like, how in the world? That doesn't even make sense. Terror means we hate evil? But as a statement of what we need to do to be a good worker, of what it means to serve well, yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Boss wants us to do this. That calling God boss means we are expected to hate evil. Yeah, absolutely, totally. My favorite is Psalm 130, 3-4. If you, O Lord, kept a record of sins, O Lord, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness. Therefore you are Yabas. Fearing. And that is also translated, you are feared. Because there is forgiveness in you, you are feared. Fearing somebody because they give you forgiveness is absolute insanity. That doesn't make any sense in the world. But making them your boss because they offer you forgiveness? Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely signing on with a forgiving boss. Even passages that are directly about fear make more sense when you look at it through this lens, right? So 1 Samuel 7:7 says, when the Philistines heard that Israel had assembled at Mizpah, blah, blah, rulers of the Philistines came up to attack them. And when the Israelites heard of it, they were Yabas because of the Philistines. They were afraid, for sure, but they weren't just afraid. They began looking at the Philistines as their bosses. They began looking at the Philistines as their masters when they came up. Oh, that's not good, right? Puts a different spin on it. But as time passed, the people kept wandering away. They kept finding other bosses. The prophets kept asking, don't you have God as boss? Why aren't you yes-bossing with God? Why aren't you fearing? Why aren't you yeah-bossing the Lord? You're going to get fired if you don't yes-boss better. They leaned into the fear aspect more and more. That if you keep doing this, God's going to be mad at you and mess you up. But that wasn't supposed to be the focus. That was supposed to be the avenue of last resort. As a father, about the last thing I ever want my kids to do is to be scared of me. I will have failed on so many levels if my kids walk around in fear of me every day. But if they are ever about to do something truly, stupidly dangerous, and nothing else can stop them. Nothing that we have taught them, no laws, no rules, nothing. I really hope that they think, oh, Dad will be so pissed, and don't do it. Right? Like if all else fails, I really hope that that thought enters their head and it stops them. Or at least they think twice about it. As Yabas. But that fear became the only thing that people saw when they saw God. I truly believe that one of the reasons Christ came is because by being God in flesh, he showed us that there is more to Yabas than fear, that fear wasn't ever really the point. Rather, Jesus switched the words entirely while talking about the same concept. Rather than Yabas, Jesus wanted us to say, yeah, Dad? Because he talked about God not as master, but as Father. Right? Pater hemon ha antoi suranois, our Father, the one in the heavens. He changed the discussion because the discussion had missed the point. That God is not terror, God is love. People sell fear. They sell God as the boogeyman that we should be afraid of, but God is the father boss that we serve because we know what God does. We know how God forgives because serving God means hating evil and lifting up the lowly, and that includes us, fortunately. Because God is a loving father and a good boss. If you've been raised on hellfire and brimstone, if people have tried to put the fear of God into you, I am so sorry. God is a great boss and wants us to yes boss, or more accurately still be able to say, yeah, Dad? And that means to serve. That means to be transformed. That means to honor, respect, grow with love, trust. And yes, if we truly have no other reason not to sin, then go ahead and fear the consequences of what you're about to do. But don't fear God. And don't fear anyone that tells you you should. We have a whole host of reasons to yes boss, to yare, to serve. But don't rely on fear. Don't live in fear, and certainly don't teach it to others. Teach love, choose honor, respect, reverence, service. Choose yes, boss. Choose, yeah, Dad, in all of its forms. And that never means living in terror or fear.